In the unforgiving mountains of Colorado Territory, 1882, where water ran scarce and mercy even scarcer, some stories began not with violence or gold fever, but with the simple sound of a man begging for his life. This is one of those stories, about a mining engineer running from a cave-in that killed 17 men, a fever that threatened to claim him in the wilderness, and a widow whose unexpected compassion would save them both and forge a bond neither expected. Marcus Webb had been many things in his 34 years. Engineer, surveyor, and company man. But as he stumbled into Copper Falls with fever burning through his veins like wildfire, his throat so parched he could barely speak, he was simply a man dying of thirst in a land where water meant survival and wells belonged to those who owned the land. His business partner's final words haunted every painful step: tell them the truth about what happened. Now 3 days without clean water, watching infection spread through a wound on his leg, Marcus faced the terrifying possibility that the truth might die with him in these mountains. Copper Falls clung to the mountainside like a stubborn mule refusing to move. Built around a dried-up mining operation and sustained by a handful of wells controlled by the company store, the town was a place where water cost more than whiskey and strangers were about as welcome as rattlesnakes in a Sunday service. But sometimes redemption came wearing the most unlikely faces. And sometimes survival depended on the mercy of someone who'd learned the hard way that suffering binds people together. The fever dreams had started 2 days ago. Marcus Webb couldn't remember much after falling during his flight from the collapsed mine shaft, just pain, thirst so intense it felt like his throat was lined with broken glass, and the knowledge that without water, he'd be dead before sunset. His horse had given out a mile back, too exhausted to continue. Now Marcus dragged himself down the rocky trail toward Copper Falls, each step an agony that shot through his infected leg like lightning. Copper Falls looked like hope had packed its bags and moved on years ago. Buildings sagged under the weight of too many harsh winters, their paint stripped away by wind and neglect. The main street was rutted dirt mixed with mine tailings and broken equipment. But it was civilization, and civilization meant water, and water meant Marcus might live long enough to tell the truth about the Silverton mine disaster. He collapsed in front of the company store, his vision swimming with dark spots. A crowd gathered quickly, not out of compassion, but curiosity. Strangers were rare in Copper Falls, and this one looked like trouble. "Water," Marcus croaked, his voice barely audible. "Please. I'll pay." The store owner, a hard-faced man named Jeremiah Colt, stepped onto the porch and looked down at Marcus with cold calculation. "Well, ain't for public use. Company property. You want water, you work for the company." "I can't." Marcus tried to rise but his leg buckled. The wound, infected from his fall in the rocks, had turned the skin around it an angry red that promised blood poisoning if not treated soon. "Please. I'm dying." "Then die somewhere else," Colt said flatly. "This ain't a charity house." A woman's voice cut through the crowd like a knife through butter. "Jeremiah Colt, you ought to be ashamed of yourself." The crowd parted as Catherine Morgan walked through, a bucket of water from her own well balanced easily on her hip. She was perhaps 30, with raven black hair pulled back severely from a face that might have been beautiful if not for the hardness that came from too much loss. Her dress was simple but clean, and her dark eyes blazed with righteous anger. "That man is clearly ill," she said, setting the bucket down beside Marcus. "And you'd leave him to die in the street like a dog." "He's a stranger, Catherine," Colt replied. "And you know what happened last time you trusted a stranger." Catherine's face paled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Get out of my way." She knelt beside Marcus, lifting his head gently and bringing a ladle of water to his cracked lips. The first drops hit his tongue like salvation itself. He drank greedily, desperately, until Catherine pulled the ladle away. "Slowly," she cautioned. "Too much too fast will make you sick." Marcus looked up at her through fevered eyes. She was backlit by the harsh mountain sun, creating a halo effect that made her seem almost angelic. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." "Can you stand?" she asked. I don't think so. My leg. Catherine examined the wound with practiced efficiency, her lips pressing into a thin line. That needs cleaning and bandaging immediately. You'll lose the leg if it's not treated. She looked up at the crowd that had gathered. Someone help me get him to my house. No one moved. The silence stretched uncomfortably until a young Mexican man named Diego stepped forward. I'll help, Señora Morgan. Together, they half-carried, half-dragged Marcus to Catherine's small house at the edge of town. It was modest but well-maintained, with a garden that somehow flourished despite the altitude and a well that was clearly the envy of the neighborhood. Inside, the house was spotlessly clean, with dried herbs hanging from the rafters and books lining a small shelf near the fireplace. Catherine worked with quiet efficiency, cleaning Marcus's wound with water she heated over the fire. The pain was excruciating, but Marcus bit down on a leather strap she'd given him and tried not to cry out. When she was finished, she bandaged the leg with strips of clean cloth and covered him with a quilt that smelled faintly of lavender. Sleep now, she said softly. I'll bring you broth when you wake. Why? Marcus managed to ask through chattering teeth. The fever was raging now, his body shaking despite the warmth of the blankets. Why help me? Catherine looked at him with eyes that held depths of sorrow he couldn't begin to understand. Because someone once helped my husband when he was dying, and I wasn't there. I couldn't save him. But maybe I can save you. She turned away, but not before Marcus saw the tears gathering in her eyes. That night, as Marcus drifted in and out of fever dreams, Catherine sat by his bedside with cool cloths and prayers. She'd lost her husband Thomas 2 years ago in a mining accident, not from the cave-in itself, but from thirst in the 3 days it took rescuers to reach the trapped miners. The company had refused to share their emergency water supply, saying it was too valuable to waste on men who were probably already dead. By the time they were pulled from the collapsed shaft, Thomas and 4 others had died not from their injuries, but from dehydration. The irony of now using her own precious water to save a mining engineer wasn't lost on Catherine. But she'd learned that bitterness was a poison that hurt the bearer more than the intended target. If she could save this man, whoever he was, maybe it would help balance the scales for Thomas's senseless death. Please, Marcus mumbled in his fever. Tell them. The supports were inadequate. I warned them. 17 men. Catherine leaned closer, wiping his burning forehead. Shoo, rest now. They blamed me, Marcus continued, his eyes unfocused. Said I approved the design. But I didn't. I refused to sign off. They did it anyway. Catherine's hand stilled. 17 men. She'd heard about the Silverton mine disaster 3 months ago. It had been the talk of the territory, a catastrophic collapse that killed 17 miners and injured dozens more. The territorial investigation had blamed the engineering consultant, a man named Marcus Webb, for approving inadequate support structures. She looked down at the man in her bed with new understanding. He wasn't just running from death, he was running from blame for a disaster that had destroyed families across the territory. Did you do it? She asked quietly, even though he probably couldn't hear her. Did you kill those men? But watching him thrash in fevered anguish, hearing him cry out warnings in his sleep, Catherine thought she knew the answer. This wasn't the behavior of a man who'd callously approved faulty designs for profit. This was a man haunted by truth that no one would believe. Morning came slowly to the mountains, the sun turning the peaks gold before finally reaching the valley where Copper Falls huddled against the cold. Marcus woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving quietly through the house. His fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving him weak but clear-headed for the first time in days. Catherine appeared in the doorway with a cup of coffee and a bowl of thin oatmeal. You're awake. Good. You need to eat. Marcus struggled to sit up, his leg throbbing but no longer burning with infection. How long have I been here? 2 days. The fever finally broke last night. She set the food on a small table beside the bed. You talked quite a bit while you were delirious. Marcus's heart sank. What did I say? Enough. Catherine sat in a chair across from him, her dark eyes studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. You're Marcus Webb. The engineer from the Silverton disaster. There was no point in denying it. Yes. Are you responsible? The question was direct, unflinching. Marcus appreciated that she didn't dance around it with false politeness. No. I refused to approve the support design. Told the company owners it was inadequate. They forged my signature on the approval documents and proceeded anyway. Can you prove it? I had documentation. Letters, telegrams, my original reports. All kept in my partner's office in Denver. Marcus's voice grew heavy with grief. William Thompson. He was helping me prepare evidence for the territorial hearing. Then his office caught fire. William died in the blaze, and every piece of evidence burned with him. Catherine's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. Convenient timing. Too convenient. The mining company, Consolidated Western, they're powerful. They own half the territorial legislature and most of the judges. When I heard about the fire, I knew I had to run. They'd already put a price on my head, claiming I'd fled to avoid prosecution. So you came to Copper Falls. Marcus tried to drink the coffee, but his hands were shaking too badly. Catherine took the cup from him and held it to his lips, the gesture somehow intimate despite the circumstances. I was trying to reach the territorial capital in Denver. Thought maybe I could find someone who'd listen, some official who wasn't in Consolidated Western's pocket. But I fell during a storm, injured my leg, lost my horse. Copper Falls was the closest town. And you walked into the one place where water is controlled by the same company that wants you dead, Catherine said dryly. Consolidated Western owns the wells here. Jeremiah Colt runs the company store. Marcus closed his eyes. Of course they did. His bad luck was almost comical at this point. Then I'll leave as soon as I can walk. I won't put you in danger. You can barely sit up, much less walk. That leg needs at least another week to heal properly. Catherine stood, gathering the empty bowl. Besides, I'm not afraid of Consolidated Western. They took my husband from me. They don't get to take my humanity too. Over the next few days, as Marcus slowly recovered his strength, Catherine told him about Thomas. About how he'd been a good man, honest and hard-working. How he'd died in darkness, his lips cracked and bleeding from thirst while water sat in barrels just 100 yards away. How the company had claimed they were following proper protocols, by not compromising their emergency supplies for men who might already be dead. 17 minutes, Catherine said one evening as they sat by the fire. That's how long it took after they finally brought water to the trapped miners before Thomas died. 17 minutes. If they'd shared the water sooner, he'd still be alive. Marcus listened with growing horror. The same company that had forged his signature and killed 17 miners at Silverton had let Thomas Morgan die of thirst rather than share their water. The pattern of callous disregard for human life was unmistakable. I'm sorry, he said, the words utterly inadequate. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry. Help me stop them. Catherine leaned forward, firelight dancing in her dark eyes. You said your partner was keeping evidence. What if he made copies? What if there's another set of documents somewhere? William was thorough, but, Marcus paused, thinking. His wife. Margaret Thompson. She's a schoolteacher in Denver. William might have sent copies to her for safekeeping. Then we need to get to Denver. Marcus looked at her in surprise. We? You think you can make it there alone? Catherine raised an eyebrow. You can barely walk to the outhouse without help. Besides, I have questions for Consolidated Western's board about their policies regarding emergency water supplies. This is personal for me too. Catherine, it's dangerous. These men have already killed to protect their secrets. Then we'd better be smarter than them. She stood, pulling a trunk from beneath her bed. Inside were maps, documents, and a small pistol. My father was a surveyor before the war. He taught me to read maps and shoot straight. And I know these mountains better than any company man. Marcus watched as she spread a territorial map on the table, her fingers tracing routes to Denver. This woman, this widow who'd saved his life with nothing but compassion and well water, was proposing they take on one of the most powerful mining companies in the territory together. Why? He asked. Why risk everything for this? Catherine looked up from the map, and in her eyes Marcus saw not just grief but righteous fury. Because Thomas died believing that good people would make things right. Because 17 families in Silverton lost fathers and sons to company greed. Because if we don't stand up to evil, we become complicit in it. She paused, her voice softening. And because you almost died asking for water, and I know what that desperation feels like. I couldn't save Thomas, but maybe together we can make sure no one else dies the same way. In that moment, Marcus understood that Catherine Morgan wasn't just a kind woman who'd helped a stranger. She was a force of nature, tempered by loss into something hard and brilliant as diamond. And despite the danger, despite the odds stacked impossibly against them, he found himself believing that maybe, just maybe, they could win. All right, he said. We'll go to Denver. Together. Catherine smiled, and it transformed her face from merely handsome to genuinely beautiful. Good. We leave as soon as you can ride. I'll make arrangements. That night, as Marcus lay in bed thinking about the journey ahead, he realized something surprising. For the first time since the Silverton disaster, he didn't feel alone. Catherine Morgan had given him more than water and medical care, she'd given him purpose and partnership. Whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Outside, the mountain wind howled through Copper Falls, carrying the scent of snow from the high peaks. Inside Catherine's small house, two wounded souls had found each other in shared grief and common purpose. The path ahead would be dangerous, but they'd walk it side by side, sustained by something more precious than gold or water, the belief that truth and justice still mattered in a world that often forgot both. The preparations took 3 days. Catherine was methodical, planning their route to avoid company towns and settlements where Consolidated Western's influence ran deep. She purchased supplies with money she'd been saving, money that was supposed to go toward improving her well, and arranged for her neighbors to care for her garden and house while she was gone. Marcus watched her work with growing admiration. Catherine moved through the world with quiet competence, never wasting motion or words. She negotiated with Diego for 2 horses, traded vegetables from her garden for dried beef and hardtack, and somehow convinced the town's elderly doctor to provide medical supplies without asking too many questions about where they were going. How do you do it? Marcus asked one evening as she packed saddlebags with practiced efficiency. Do what? Move through the world like this. Like you're not afraid of anything. Catherine paused, a bundle of bandages in her hands. I'm afraid of plenty of things. But I learned after Thomas died that fear is a luxury I can't afford. Either you let it paralyze you, or you use it to sharpen your purpose. I chose purpose. On the morning of the 4th day, they rode out of Copper Falls in the gray hour before dawn. Catherine had left a note for the few people who might worry, Diego and old Mrs. Patterson who lived next door, saying only that she'd be gone for a few weeks on personal business. The lie sat uncomfortably, but the truth would only endanger them. They traveled north through mountain passes still dusted with early snow, avoiding the main roads where they might encounter company patrols or bounty hunters looking for Marcus. Catherine navigated using her father's old maps, updated with notes she'd made over years of traveling these mountains with Thomas during their brief marriage. He was a prospector, she explained as they rode. Not a miner, Thomas hated working underground. But he loved the mountains, loved the possibility of finding something valuable. We'd spend whole summers up here, just the two of us, searching for color in the streams. Did you ever find anything? Catherine smiled sadly. Nothing worth selling. But we found plenty worth keeping, beautiful places, quiet moments, a kind of happiness that didn't depend on gold or company scrip. She paused. That's why he took the mining job. We needed steady money. Her voice caught slightly, I was expecting a child. We lost the baby at 4 months, and Thomas blamed himself. Thought if he hadn't been working such long hours underground, maybe I wouldn't have been alone when it happened. Marcus didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. Sometimes silence was better than inadequate words. They made camp that night in a high valley sheltered from the wind. Catherine showed Marcus how to build a fire that wouldn't create telltale smoke and where to position their bedrolls to stay warm without being visible from the trail. She was a natural scout, reading the landscape like some people read books. As they ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack softened in coffee, Marcus found himself studying her face in the firelight. Catherine was beautiful in an unadorned way. No fancy hairstyles or rouge could improve on the clean lines of her features or the intelligence that shone in her dark eyes. But it was her competence that truly attracted him. She was completely self-sufficient, needing no one to survive, yet choosing to help him anyway. "Why are you staring?" she asked without looking up from her coffee. Marcus felt heat rise to his face. "I was just thinking that you're remarkable." "I'm practical," Catherine corrected. "There's a difference." "No, you're remarkable. Most people would have left me to die in that street. You didn't have to help me, didn't have to risk your safety or spend your resources. But you did anyway." Catherine finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "Maybe I saw something of Thomas in you. Another good man being crushed by a system that values profit over people." "Am I?" Marcus asked quietly. "A good man?" "I think so. Otherwise you wouldn't have refused to sign off on those inadequate supports. You wouldn't have risked everything to tell the truth." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. "Good people suffer in this world, Marcus. But that doesn't mean we should stop trying to be good." They traveled for 2 more days through increasingly difficult terrain. Marcus's leg still pained him, but Catherine's treatment had been effective, the wound was healing cleanly without infection. His strength returned gradually, and by the 3rd day he could ride all day without needing rest. On the afternoon of their 4th day out from Copper Falls, they encountered trouble. 3 riders appeared on the trail behind them, moving too fast to be casual travelers. Catherine spotted them first, her sharp eyes picking out the dust cloud long before Marcus noticed. "Company men?" Marcus asked, reaching instinctively for the rifle Catherine had insisted he carry. "Maybe. Or bounty hunters." Catherine studied the riders through a small telescope she'd produced from her saddlebags. "Either way, we need to disappear." She led them off the main trail onto a narrow path that Marcus would never have spotted on his own. It wound through a boulder field and into a thick stand of aspens whose white trunks would make them nearly invisible if they stayed still. They dismounted and waited, holding the horses' bridles to keep them quiet. The riders passed within 50 yards of their hiding place. Marcus got a good look at them, hard men with guns worn easy on their hips and the kind of weathered faces that came from years of rough living. Not company men in suits, but the hired muscle companies used when they needed plausible deniability. "Bounty hunters," Catherine whispered once they'd passed. "Looking for someone." "Could be you." "We need to assume they are," Marcus replied grimly. "Word must have spread about a sick man arriving in Copper Falls. Consolidated Western has informants everywhere." They waited a full hour before resuming their journey, now traveling with even more caution. Catherine led them higher into the mountains, following game trails and dry streambeds that would leave minimal tracks. She was playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek across miles of wilderness, and Marcus could only follow and trust her instincts. That night, they made a cold camp with no fire. Marcus shivered in his blankets despite the extra layers Catherine had insisted he wear. She sat beside him, sharing body heat in the practical way of people who understood that survival sometimes required intimacy. "Tell me about the Silverton mine," she said quietly. "I want to understand what really happened." So Marcus told her about how Consolidated Western had hired him to assess the mine's expansion plans. How he'd immediately seen the problems with their proposed support structures, columns spaced too far apart, cross-bracing that was inadequate for the weight of the overburden, shortcuts that would save the company money but put miners' lives at risk. "I wrote 3 separate reports," he said. "Each one saying the same thing: the design was fundamentally unsafe. I recommended either a complete redesign or abandoning the expansion entirely. But the company had already sold shares based on projected production from the expanded mine. Changing the design would cost money and delay profits. So they forged your signature and built it anyway." "Yes. And 17 men died when it collapsed during the first month of operation." Marcus's voice grew rough with emotion. 17 families destroyed. Dozens more injured. "And the company blamed me, said I'd approved the design and then fled to avoid responsibility." Catherine was quiet for a long moment. "When we reach Denver, what then? Even if we find this evidence, Consolidated Western owns judges and politicians. How do we make anyone listen?" William had a contact at the territorial newspaper, a journalist named Sarah Brennan who's been investigating mining companies for years. "She's honest, fearless, and has connections in Washington. If we can get the evidence to her, she'll publish the truth where the company can't suppress it." "And then?" Marcus turned to look at Catherine in the starlight. "Then maybe those 17 families get justice. Maybe future miners don't die because companies cut corners. Maybe we make a difference. Maybe we get killed," Catherine added, but there was no fear in her voice. Just clear-eyed acknowledgement of the risks. "That too," Marcus admitted. "But I'd rather die fighting for the truth than live knowing I ran away from it." Catherine nodded slowly. "Good. Then we're agreed." They rode into Denver 6 days later, dusty and exhausted but alive. The city sprawled across the plains where the mountains met the grasslands, a growing metropolis that served as the territorial capital and center of mining commerce. Buildings of brick and stone stood several stories tall, and the streets were crowded with wagons, horses, and people pursuing the endless business of civilization. Catherine arranged lodging at a modest boarding house run by a widow who asked no questions about the weather-beaten couple who paid in advance with silver coins. They cleaned up, changed into respectable clothes Catherine had somehow thought to pack, and set out to find Margaret Thompson. William's widow lived in a neat frame house near the school where she taught. She answered their knock with red-rimmed eyes and a suspicious expression that softened only slightly when Marcus introduced himself. "You," she said, her voice heavy with grief and accusation. "William died trying to clear your name." "I know. Mrs. Thompson, I'm so sorry. But William believed in the truth, and I think he would want us to continue his work." Margaret studied them both for a long moment, Marcus with his earnest expression and healing limp, Catherine with her quiet strength and no-nonsense manner. Finally, she stepped back. "Come in. But if you're lying to me, I have my late husband's pistol and I know how to use it." Inside, Margaret's home was a shrine to her lost husband. Photographs lined the mantel, books he'd collected filled the shelves, and his pipe still sat in an ashtray as if he might return any moment to smoke it. She served them tea with shaking hands, grief still too fresh to have developed the protective callus of time. "William was keeping files on the Silverton case," Marcus said carefully. "Documentation proving that I refused to approve the support design. Do you know if he made copies?" "He made copies of everything," Margaret said bitterly. "That's what got him killed. Consolidated Western set that fire deliberately. The marshal claims it was an accident, but William told me he'd been receiving threats. Said men had been following him, asking questions about his clients. Do you still have the copies? Margaret looked at Catherine. Who are you? Why are you helping him? Because the same company that killed your husband killed mine, Catherine said simply. Thomas Morgan. He died in a cave-in at one of Consolidated Western's mines. They let him die of thirst rather than share emergency water supplies. The two widows looked at each other with sudden understanding, a recognition of shared loss and shared anger. Margaret's expression hardened with resolve. The files are in my father's bank vault. William moved them there a week before he died, said if anything happened to him I should contact a journalist named Sarah Brennan. She stood abruptly. Wait here. She returned a moment later with a key and an address written on a piece of paper. This is where you'll find Sarah. Give her the files and tell her everything. She's been investigating Consolidated Western for 2 years. She'll know what to do with the evidence. They spent the rest of the afternoon at the bank, a fortress-like building of stone and iron that catered to Denver's wealthy and powerful. Margaret's father had been a successful merchant, and his vault held not just his family's valuables but the documentary evidence that would bring down Consolidated Western. The files were extensive. Original letters from Marcus refusing to approve the design. Telegrams between company executives discussing how to proceed without his signature. Most damning of all, internal memos showing that senior management had known about the safety issues and chosen to ignore them, calculating that potential lawsuit costs were cheaper than proper construction. This is enough, Marcus said, his hands trembling as he read through documents he'd thought lost forever. This proves everything. Sarah Brennan's office was above a saloon in Denver's less respectable district. The journalist was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s with ink-stained fingers and a skeptical expression that suggested she'd heard every lie ever told. But as she read through the files, her skepticism transformed into fierce determination. This is dynamite, she said finally. Consolidated Western has been claiming for months that you approved those supports and then fled. These documents prove they committed fraud and deliberately endangered miners' lives. With this, I can write stories that newspapers across the territory will have to print. Will it be enough? Catherine asked. They're powerful. They own judges and politicians. Maybe not all of them, Sarah replied with a grim smile. I have contacts in Washington, senators who've been looking for evidence of corruption in territorial mining operations. This case could trigger federal investigations into dozens of companies. Consolidated Western won't be able to buy their way out of national scrutiny. She looked at Marcus and Catherine with new respect. You two have done something remarkable. This could change how mining companies operate throughout the West. The stories began appearing 3 days later. Sarah Brennan published her exposé in the Denver Post under the headline, Silverton Disaster, New Evidence Points to Corporate Fraud. Other newspapers picked up the story within hours. By the end of the week, the scandal had reached Washington, and federal investigators were en route to the territory. Consolidated Western's stock price collapsed. Senior executives resigned or fled the territory. The territorial governor, facing pressure from Washington, announced a complete review of mining safety regulations and promised prosecutions for anyone involved in the Silverton fraud. Marcus and Catherine watched it unfold from the safety of Margaret Thompson's house, where they'd been staying while the investigation proceeded. The vindication was sweet, but it came with a bitter aftertaste. 17 men were still dead, and no amount of justice would bring them back. What now? Catherine asked one evening as they sat on Margaret's porch watching the sun set over the mountains. Marcus looked at her, this remarkable woman who'd saved his life and helped him reclaim his name. Over the past weeks, something had grown between them beyond gratitude or shared purpose. It was in the way she anticipated his needs, how he found himself seeking her opinion on everything, the comfortable silences they shared that spoke louder than words. I don't know, he admitted. I've spent so long running, so long fighting, I'm not sure what comes after victory. Maybe peace, Catherine suggested softly. Maybe building something instead of just surviving. In Copper Falls? Maybe. Or somewhere else. Somewhere we could start fresh, without ghosts haunting every corner. She turned to look at him, her dark eyes serious. Together, if you'd want that. Marcus felt his heart hammer against his ribs. Catherine, I have nothing to offer you. My reputation is restored, but I'm not a wealthy man. I can't give you the life you deserve. I don't need wealth, Catherine interrupted. I need partnership. Someone who understands loss but still believes in hope. Someone who'll stand with me against injustice instead of looking the other way. She paused, color rising in her cheeks. Someone who looks at me the way you do when you think I'm not watching. And how do I look at you? Like I'm water in the desert, she said quietly. Like I'm home. Marcus reached for her hand, marveling at the calluses that spoke of hard work and the strength that came from surviving unimaginable loss. You are home. You have been since the moment you gave me water in that street. He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, tasting the salt of her tears and the promise of future happiness. When they broke apart, Catherine was smiling through her tears. So what do we do? She asked. We go back to Copper Falls, Marcus decided. We reclaim your house and your life. I'll work as an engineer, honest work, making sure mines are safe. You'll continue healing people. And together, we'll prove that good people can build something beautiful from the wreckage of tragedy. Together, Catherine agreed. Always. They married 3 weeks later in Margaret Thompson's parlor, with Sarah Brennan and Margaret as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, but it marked the beginning of something profound, two damaged souls choosing to build a life together, sustained not by passion alone but by mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of deep friendship that grows from facing darkness side by side. The journey back to Copper Falls took them through the same mountain passes where they'd fled from bounty hunters weeks before. But everything felt different now. The threat was gone, replaced by possibility. They rode not as fugitives but as partners, making plans for the future they'd build together. Copper Falls greeted their return with surprise and, eventually, celebration. The story of Catherine's journey to help clear Marcus's name had reached the town through newspapers and gossip. The community that had watched a stranger nearly die in their street now welcomed that same man as a hero and Catherine's husband. Jeremiah Colt, the company store owner who'd refused Marcus water, lost his business when Consolidated Western's territorial operations were shut down pending investigation. The wells that had been company property were transferred to community ownership, ensuring that no one would ever again be denied water in Copper Falls. Catherine and Marcus rebuilt her house, expanding it to include a proper office where Marcus could work on engineering consultations and Catherine could treat patients. They turned the old stable into a workshop where Marcus taught mining safety to young men entering the industry, ensuring that the lessons learned at Silverton wouldn't be forgotten. Their first child arrived a year later, a daughter they named Margaret, after William Thompson's widow who'd kept the faith when everything seemed lost. Their son Thomas came 2 years after that, named for the husband Catherine had lost but would never forget. The children grew up hearing stories about courage and justice, about standing up for what's right even when it's dangerous, about how love can grow from the most desperate circumstances. Marcus never forgot the moment when Catherine had given him water in that dusty street. On their anniversary each year, he would present her with a small gift, a new bucket, a ladle, a well-crafted cistern, each one a reminder that she'd saved his life with nothing but compassion and well water. Catherine would laugh and call him sentimental, but she kept every gift, treasuring them as symbols of how far they'd come. 20 years passed in the quiet rhythm of mountain life. Marcus became known throughout the territory as the engineer who cares, a man who would rather lose a contract than compromise on safety. His textbook, Practical Mining Safety, became required reading for engineers across the West. Catherine's reputation as a healer grew until people traveled from hundreds of miles away seeking her care. But perhaps their greatest legacy was simpler than professional accomplishments. They proved, through daily choices to love and support each other, that tragedy didn't have to define a person. That loss could be transformed into purpose. That two broken people could become whole together. Diego, the young Mexican man who'd helped carry Marcus to Catherine's house that first day, eventually married and built his own life in Copper Falls. He often told the story to his children about the day a stranger nearly died asking for water and how Senora Morgan had defied the whole town to save him. "That's what love looks like," he'd say. "Not just romance, but courage. Standing up for what's right even when everyone says you're foolish. Giving away your most precious resource to save someone who can't repay you." Margaret Webb, now 16, stood in her father's workshop watching him demonstrate proper support beam calculations to a group of young miners. She'd inherited her mother's dark eyes and her father's methodical mind, along with something else, a fierce belief that people mattered more than profits. "Why did you keep fighting?" she asked him later that evening as they walked home through Copper Falls Main Street, now paved and lined with gas lamps. "When everyone thought you were guilty, when the company was so powerful, why didn't you just run away?" Marcus looked at his daughter, seeing Catherine's determination in her young face. "Because your mother showed me that running wasn't the answer. She gave me water when I was dying, but more than that, she gave me a reason to stand and fight." "Was it love?" "It was more than love," Marcus replied. "It was partnership. Your mother and I became stronger together than we ever were alone. That's what marriage should be, not just romance, but two people who make each other better, braver, more capable of facing whatever life brings." Inside their expanded home, Catherine was treating a young woman who'd injured her hand in a kitchen accident. Thomas, now 14, assisted his mother with the same quiet competence she'd shown that first night treating Marcus's infected leg. The boy had his father's features but his mother's healing instincts. "Will I lose the hand?" the young woman asked, fear evident in her voice. "Not if we treat it properly," Catherine assured her. "But you need to keep it clean and change the bandages daily. Can you do that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you, Mrs. Webb." After the patient left, Thomas helped his mother clean the instruments. "Mama, what made you decide to help Papa that first day? Everyone says you risked everything for a stranger." Catherine was quiet for a moment, remembering that hot afternoon when she'd walked through the crowd with her bucket of water. "Your father was dying, and I had the means to save him. It really was that simple. I couldn't live with myself if I'd walked past someone suffering when I had the power to help." "But it wasn't simple," Thomas pressed. "The company could have punished you. You used your own water when it was so valuable." "Thomas, listen to me." Catherine set down the instruments and looked at her son seriously. "There will come times in your life when doing the right thing costs you dearly. When standing up for someone means risking what you have. In those moments, you have to decide what kind of person you want to be. I chose to be someone who values human life over company rules. I chose to be someone who wouldn't let fear stop me from doing good." That evening, the Webb family gathered for dinner as they did every night. It was their sacred time, no patients, no consultations, no work. Just the four of them sharing food and conversation, building the foundation of love that would sustain them through whatever challenges came. "I received a letter today," Marcus announced as they ate Catherine's venison stew. "From the territorial governor. They want to name the new mining safety regulations after me, the Webb Safety Standards." Margaret beamed with pride. "Papa, that's wonderful." "It's not about me," Marcus said firmly. "It's about making sure no more families lose fathers and husbands because companies cut corners. Every regulation, every safety requirement, represents lives that might be saved." "Your father's right," Catherine added. "Real change isn't about glory or recognition. It's about the daily work of making things better, one person at a time, one safety improvement at a time, one act of kindness at a time. Thomas looked between his parents, seeing the deep connection they shared, the way his father's hand rested on his mother's shoulder, how she smiled at him with eyes that held 2 decades of shared experiences. "Tell us again how you met," he said. "The real version, not the story everyone else tells." So Marcus and Catherine recounted the tale once more, taking turns with the telling. How he'd collapsed in the street, desperate for water. How she'd defied Jeremiah Colt and the entire town to save him. How they'd fled through the mountains, hunted by bounty hunters and driven by the need to expose the truth. How they'd fallen in love not through grand romantic gestures but through shared struggle and mutual respect. "The best part," Marcus said, looking at Catherine with undisguised affection, "is that I get to spend every day with the most remarkable woman I've ever known. Someone who saved my life not once, but continuously, by choosing to build a life with me. The best part," Catherine countered with a smile, "is that I found a partner who understands that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice we make every day. To stand together, to support each other, to build something meaningful from the wreckage of our pasts." Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. Their parents' love story wasn't like the romantic tales in books, it was better, because it was real. It was built on sacrifice and courage, sustained by daily choices to honor their commitment, made beautiful by the depth of their partnership. After dinner, Marcus and Catherine walked through their garden in the fading light. The well that had saved his life still stood, upgraded now with a proper pump and shelter. Marcus drew a bucket of water and offered it to Catherine with exaggerated ceremony. "My lady," he said with mock formality, "please accept this humble offering of life-giving water." Catherine laughed, accepting the ladle and drinking deeply. "You're ridiculous." "I'm grateful," Marcus corrected. "Every day I'm grateful that you saw past the desperate stranger and found someone worth saving." "I didn't save you," Catherine said softly. "We saved each other." It was true. Catherine had given Marcus water and healed his body, but he'd given her purpose and helped heal her grieving heart. Together, they'd created something neither could have built alone, a life filled with love, meaning, and the satisfaction of making their corner of the world a better place. As the years continued their steady march, Marcus and Catherine grew old together with the grace that comes from genuine partnership. Their hair turned silver, their steps grew slower, but their commitment to each other and their community never wavered. Margaret became a lawyer, using her father's restored reputation and her mother's moral compass to fight for workers' rights throughout the territory. She argued landmark cases that established precedents for corporate responsibility and worker safety, carrying forward her parents' legacy in new ways. Thomas followed his mother into medicine, becoming a doctor who specialized in treating mining injuries. He developed new techniques for handling the kinds of wounds and illnesses that plagued men who worked underground, always remembering his mother's teaching that healing was as much about compassion as skill. Copper Falls itself transformed from a dying mining town into a thriving community. The Webb family's influence, Marcus's engineering expertise, Catherine's medical care, and their children's professional accomplishments, helped establish the town as a model for how communities could thrive when people worked together for common good rather than individual profit. On their 25th wedding anniversary, the town organized a celebration in their honor. Nearly everyone in Copper Falls attended, along with people who'd traveled from across the territory. Former miners whose lives had been saved by Marcus's safety standards. Patients Catherine had healed. Young engineers and doctors trained by the Webb family. All came to pay tribute to two people who'd shown them what love and courage looked like. Sarah Brennan, now a famous journalist and author, gave a speech about how Marcus and Catherine's story had sparked a nationwide reform movement that had saved countless lives. "They didn't set out to be heroes," she said. "They simply refused to let injustice stand unchallenged. They saw suffering and responded with compassion. They faced powerful enemies and stood firm in truth. That's what real heroism looks like." But perhaps the most moving tribute came from Diego, now an elderly grandfather himself. He stood before the crowd and told the story one more time, about a dying stranger and a widow with a bucket of water. Senora Morgan, I still think of her that way, could have walked past, Diego said, his voice strong despite his years. She could have saved her water, protected herself, let someone else deal with the problem. But she didn't. She stopped. She cared. She acted. And because of that one choice, because of that one bucket of water, all of this followed. He gestured to the crowd, to the prosperous town, to the legacy the Webbs had built. Never underestimate what one act of kindness can create. That night, after the celebration had ended and their house was quiet again, Marcus and Catherine sat on their porch watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. They held hands, their fingers intertwined with the comfortable familiarity of 25 years of marriage. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Marcus asked. "About what would have happened if you'd walked past me?" "Sometimes," Catherine admitted. "But not with regret. Only with gratitude that I listened to the better angels of my nature. I was so close to death. Another hour, maybe less. But you didn't die. You lived. We built this life together. We raised good children who are making the world better. We've touched hundreds of lives through our work." Catherine squeezed his hand. "That's what matters, not what almost happened, but what we chose to make happen." Marcus lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her weathered knuckles. "I love you, Catherine Webb. Every day I love you more. And I love you, Marcus Webb. My partner, my friend, my home." They sat in comfortable silence as the night deepened around them, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and built a life that proved love could triumph over any adversity. The water that had saved Marcus's life that first day had nourished not just his body but an entire legacy, a family, a community, a movement for justice that would outlive them both. 30 years after Marcus stumbled into Copper Falls dying of thirst, the town dedicated a monument in the center of the main square. It was a simple fountain, water flowing continuously from a bronze sculpture depicting a woman offering a ladle to a kneeling man. The inscription read, "In honor of Catherine and Marcus Webb, who taught us that mercy, courage, and love can transform the world. May we never forget that every act of kindness matters." Marcus and Catherine, now in their 60s, stood before the monument with their children and grandchildren gathered around them. The crowd that had assembled for the dedication included miners, doctors, engineers, lawyers, people from every walk of life who'd been touched by the Webb family's influence. "It's too much," Catherine whispered to Marcus, overwhelmed by the tribute. "It's not about us," Marcus replied. "It's about what we represent, the possibility that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose compassion over convenience." The mayor, a woman who'd been one of Catherine's first patients 30 years ago, spoke to the crowd. "This fountain will serve as a reminder for generations to come. When we're faced with someone suffering, when we have the power to help but fear the cost, when we must choose between what's easy and what's right, may we remember Catherine Morgan Webb, who stopped to give water to a dying stranger. May we remember Marcus Webb, who fought for truth even when it cost him everything. May we remember that love and justice are not abstract concepts but daily choices we must make." As water splashed in the fountain, catching the afternoon sun in rainbow prisms, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him here. The collapse at Silverton. The desperate flight through the desert. The moment Catherine had appeared with her bucket of water like an answer to prayers he hadn't known how to pray. Every person's life was a series of pivotal moments, decisions that set them on one path or another. His decision to refuse to sign those inadequate support plans. Catherine's decision to help him despite the risks. Their decision to fight together for justice. Their decision to build a life together founded on mutual respect and shared values. "Papa, what are you thinking about?" Margaret asked, noticing his faraway expression. "About water," Marcus said. "About how something so simple can mean everything. Your mother gave me water when I was dying, and it saved my life. But more than that, it taught me what love really means, giving what's precious to save someone who can't repay you." Thomas, now a respected physician with his own practice in Denver, nodded. We see it every day in medicine. People who sacrifice for others, who give time and resources to help strangers, who choose compassion even when it costs them. That's the world your mother and I tried to build, Marcus said, looking at his children with pride. One where people care for each other, where we value human life above profit, where we stand up for truth even when it's difficult. You two have carried that forward in ways we never imagined. The celebration continued into the evening, but eventually Marcus and Catherine slipped away, walking slowly back to their home through streets they'd watched transform from dusty trails into a thriving town. They were tired, the kind of good tired that came from a full life well lived. No regrets? Catherine asked as they settled onto their porch, the question that had become their ritual over decades of marriage. None, Marcus replied firmly. Not a single one. Not even the hardship? The danger? The years of struggle? Especially not those, Marcus said. They made us who we are. They taught us what matters. And they gave us a story worth telling, not because it's unusual, but because it's true. Because it shows that love and courage and simple human decency can change the world. Catherine rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart. The man who'd collapsed in the street 30 years ago, desperate and dying, had become the bedrock of her life. Together they'd built something beautiful from tragedy, a family, a legacy, a testament to the transforming power of compassion. Do you remember what you asked me that first day? Catherine said softly. When I was treating your wound? I asked why you were helping me. And I said it was because I couldn't save Thomas, but maybe I could save you. Catherine lifted her head to look at him. I was wrong about that. I wasn't just saving you. I was saving myself. Finding you gave me purpose again, gave me a reason to keep fighting, keep hoping, keep believing that good things could still happen. Marcus cupped her face gently, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. We saved each other. That's what real love does, it doesn't just rescue, it transforms. It makes us better, braver, more fully ourselves. They kissed, tender and unhurried, a kiss that held 30 years of shared joys and sorrows, triumphs and struggles, the deep contentment that comes from a life built together on foundations of truth and mutual respect. As night fell over Copper Falls, lights began appearing in windows throughout the town. Each one represented a family, a life, a story. Some would be marked by tragedy, others by triumph. But all would be shaped by the choices people made in moments of testing, whether to help or ignore, to stand or retreat, to love or harden their hearts. The fountain in the town square continued its gentle splashing, water flowing endlessly as a reminder of the day Catherine Morgan gave water to a dying stranger and changed both their lives forever. It stood as testimony that mercy matters, that courage counts, that love, real love, the kind that chooses action over comfort, could indeed transform the world. Marcus and Catherine Webb sat together on their porch, hands intertwined, watching their town settle into peaceful sleep. They'd built a good life from desperate beginnings. They'd raised children who carried forward their values. They'd touched countless lives through their work and their example. But perhaps most importantly, they'd proven that two broken people could become whole together. That tragedy didn't have to define a person's story. That love, sustained by daily choices to honor commitment and support each other, could endure any storm. As Catherine drifted toward sleep, her head still resting on Marcus's shoulder, she thought about all the lives that had been touched by one simple act of compassion. The miners who'd lived because Marcus had fought for better safety standards. The patients she'd healed over decades of practice. The children, their own and others they'd helped, who'd grown up knowing they mattered, that their lives had value, that they too could make a difference. I'd do it again, she murmured, half asleep. Even knowing all the hardship that would follow. I'd still give you that water. I know, Marcus replied softly. That's who you are. That's who you've always been. My remarkable Catherine. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human struggles but somehow blessing this small corner of Colorado where two souls had found each other against impossible odds. In the morning, there would be work to do, patients to treat, consultations to perform, grandchildren to visit. But tonight, there was only this, the quiet contentment of a life well lived, a love well earned, a legacy that would outlive them both. The man who'd begged for water had found so much more. The woman who'd given it had received back far more than she'd offered. Together, they'd built something that would echo through generations, a reminder that in our darkest moments, salvation often comes not from grand gestures but from simple human kindness. From someone who sees suffering and chooses to act. From someone who values human life more than fear or convenience or profit. From someone who offers water to a stranger dying in the street and, in doing so, saves not just a life but creates a legacy of love that transforms a community and ripples outward far beyond what either could have imagined. That is what real heroism looks like. Not superheroes or saints, but ordinary people making extraordinary choices in moments of testing. Not romance divorced from reality, but partnership built on shared struggle and mutual respect. Not perfect people living perfect lives, but flawed humans choosing daily to be better, to do better, to build something meaningful from the wreckage of their pasts. Marcus and Catherine Webb's story became legend in Colorado Territory and beyond. But its power didn't come from being unusual, it came from being true. From showing that love, real love, is not just passion or feeling but action and commitment. That mercy matters. That courage counts. That every choice we make ripples outward in ways we cannot predict or control. And that sometimes, the most extraordinary love stories begin with nothing more complicated than a bucket of water and a choice to see another person's suffering as more important than our own comfort. Have you ever been saved by an unexpected act of kindness from a stranger? Or witnessed someone transform their life through the power of love and partnership? Share your stories in the comments below. We love hearing from viewers around the world who believe, like the Webbs, that compassion can change everything. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell for more incredible true stories of courage, redemption, and the enduring power of human goodness. Tomorrow we have another amazing tale that will remind you why love, in all its forms, is the most powerful force in the universe.